everyone. Welcome to We Rise Fighting. This is our first podcast. This is our first episode. Today, we're going to focus on international solidarity, talking about the people's movement in El Salvador during the 80s and the labor struggle here in the United States. I'm here with Jerry. I'm here with Brian, and we are going to talk to you just right after this. All right, everyone, what's up? Welcome to our podcast. This is our first episode, our first edition. It's brand spanking new. My name is Rick Urrutia. I am here with my comrades and friends, Jerry and Brian, and we are going to go ahead and introduce ourselves real quick. You know, my name is Rick. I live in Denver. I am a former labor organizer, former labor researcher, former labor representative, and I've organized a union in my own workplace. I've also traveled through Latin America, meeting with union members and just learning about them, how they do things in different countries, and bring that information back and sharing it with y'all. So that's part of what we're going to do right now in this episode today. Next up, we have Jerry. Jerry, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay. Thank you, Rick. Hi, everybody. I'm Jerry Scapitulo. I live in Boston. I teach labor history at Cambridge College in Boston. I'm also a more or less retired union organizer. And as a worker, I worked under a District 65 contract in a warehouse in Boston, at Kroger's under UFCW contract, and a few other places. And happy to be here. Glad you're with us.
All right, Brian, what's up with you?
All right, it's good to see you all today. Thanks, Rick and Jerry. I'm a labor community organizer, writer, and photojournalist from Wisconsin. I've covered with my journalism and photography various strikes and labor actions across the United States and beyond, and continue to be a union organizer and a community activist in a variety of different spaces and places. So it's good to be with you all.
Yep, and Brian and I also met at the University of Massachusetts, where we delved deep into some labor theory, man. We studied some labor history, some labor theory, some corporate research. So yeah, we got that connection too. And I met Jerry by virtue of knowing Brian. So it's a cool crew here, man. And, you know, welcome to this episode. We're happy to have you here. We're going to kick things off, or I should say, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. First, we're talking a little bit about El Salvador and the history of El Salvador. So first off, for those of you who have never heard of El Salvador or have your doubts, El Salvador is a tiny nation in Central America, south of Mexico, south of Guatemala. You can drive from one end of the country to the other in 3 hours. It's the size of Massachusetts. Okay. And it's always been an agricultural country, you know, starting in the 1900s, you know, the coffee production and the cotton production in the country really started booming. And that's basically the direction the country started going in for many generations. You know, El Salvador has been an agricultural nation since the turn of the century, and its economy has always been controlled by 14 families. Ever since the beginning of, you know, this setup, this El Salvador that we know, you know, the agricultural workers have always gained poverty wages, you know, and they've never had secure employment. And so that's a very precarious type of job that you have in El Salvador when you're an agricultural worker, you're a campesino, right? And going all the way back to like almost 100 years now, to the 1930s, things were particularly bad in El Salvador because it was a coffee producing nation. And the 1930s was, you know, part of the Great Depression. And it affected El Salvador because it produced so much coffee and it exported it to the United States. So when the demand in the United States dropped, unfortunately, so did the wages of these agricultural workers who are already struggling. Now, for those of you who are watching on YouTube or watching in video format or anything, you're seeing one of El Salvador's greatest heroes, Farabundo Martin. Now, he was a labor organizer from the 30s, and, you know, he helped instill some social justice and some hope in agricultural workers. And he helped get some people elected, some communists elected in El Salvador during the 1930s. Unfortunately, the communists who came elected, they came with a good program as far as, increasing wages and providing unemployment benefits and all that. And that's part of why they got elected. But they were never allowed to take office by the military. And so the reason I'm showing this picture is because this, again, is one of our greatest labor organizers. And he helped organize an uprising so that the agricultural workers could get the wage increases they needed to just sustain themselves and feed themselves. Now, this is where the history of El Salvador really kind of kicks into high gear. Farabundo Martí organized an uprising against the military. And the military found out just a few days before it was scheduled to take place and carried out a massacre of about 30,000 people within the time span of a month. Okay, now I mention all that because that essentially sets the tone for El Salvador for decades to come. All right, as soon as that massacre was carried out by the military seized power. And for those of you who know a little bit of the history of El Salvador or a little bit of a history of many Latin American countries, what came into being was a series of military dictatorships. Started with the man in the middle there. El General Maximiliano Hernández Martínez was the first of these military dictators. They were always backed by the 14 families that ruled in El Salvador. They were always backed by the US. And, they carried out all forms of repression against labor activists, against students, intellectuals. It's pretty cold-blooded stuff, As you could imagine, with any military dictatorship, you live in a condition or live in a society where censorship is the norm, voting is fraudulent, strikes are repressed, any type of worker action or worker organization is repressed. And so, people, you push them back against the wall and they start to defend themselves eventually. All right. And so during those generations of military dictatorships, there was always some kind of organizing going on underneath. All right. Organizing going on by socialists, labor unionists, communists, even liberation theologists and social democrats were organizing in El Salvador just for some basic reforms, just to take people's face away from the sandbelt a little bit, from the harshness of the military dictatorship, of impoverished wages, of globalization and things like that. And so generation after generation of military dictatorship and generation after generation of people organizing under these military dictatorships brings you to the 70s, when things really started to boil over in El Salvador and people began arming themselves and started organizing into guerrilla fronts. And they decided to defend themselves against this repressive military. And so that's kind of that brings us to the history of El Salvador that more people know of, is the war that happened during the 80s. All right. And basically what happened during the 80s is you had a coalition of several different groups in El Salvador. You had a coalition of armed groups, some of them socialists, some of them liberation theologists, some of them Christian Democrats, all coming together as a united front to work to basically push back and defend themselves against the military, the U.S. military. Now, by this point, by the 80s, the U.S. is involved. It's the Reagan administration, and the Reagan administration is sending about $1 million per day to the military in El Salvador. It's also training Salvadoran military brass at the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, on how to carry out atrocities. And I'm talking about things like massacres, death squads, psychological terror, counterintelligence programs, things like that. And one of the graduates you're looking at right now, if you're watching the video, his name is Roberto Dabuison. And his nickname was actually Blowtorch Bob, because that was his preferred method of torturing people. And one of the people he carried out an assassination against was actually this man, Oscar Romero. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Oscar Romero is like the Martin Luther King of El Salvador. He gave hope to the hopeless. He gave a voice to the voiceless. You know, I think this picture does a good job of summarizing how the people of El Salvador saw him, how, you know, the most oppressed, how the most voiceless saw Oscar Romero, I think is captured well in this image. You know, it's just a campesina woman who looks just ecstatic to see him. He's, you know, he has this presence about him, and he really did speak for the poor and the oppressed of El Salvador. So for that reason, of course, Roberto Dabuisan, who was trained at the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, had him assassinated. And that really, really that was another moment that really escalated the war when people saw Oscar Romero assassinated. Now, as you can imagine, people went to his funeral. And to give you an idea of the bloodthirst of the military of that time, you know, the military started firing on the funeral procession for Oscar Romero. So that's when things got really heated in the early 80s. That's when death squads started coming out. That's when people really started defending themselves. That's when they started forming what's called the FMLN, which is basically the coalition of all these different groups that I've been talking about: the Marxists, the socialists, the communists, the revolutionaries, the social democrats, the liberation theologists, you know, all came together to form the FMLN. All right. Now, they were the guerrilla front. They were the People's Army during the 80s who defended themselves against the military. Again, the military is receiving $1 million a day and training from the US, from the Reagan administration. And what the guerrillas are receiving and what the People's Army is receiving in El Salvador, what the social struggles are receiving in El Salvador, is international solidarity. Okay. So we're basically talking about a story where one military, the Salvadoran military, is receiving $1 million a day from the US versus a People's Army who the only reason they can fight back and defend themselves is because of the international solidarity they're receiving from other social movements and people abroad. So, which gets us to the meat of what we're going to be talking about today, right? International solidarity. That's how the FMLN sustained the fight during the 80s against this repressive military. You know, and to bring it fast forward a little bit, you know, of course, you know, any war, you're going to have people fleeing, you're going to have refugees in any war. And so a lot of folks from El Salvador arrived in places like New York, arrived in places like California and Chicago, and they started taking jobs in the service industry, all right? So they started taking jobs in the janitorial industry, in restaurants and hotels, also in agriculture and gardening, things like that. And here in particular, we're going to focus today about how they entered the U.S. labor movement. And one of the places by which they did so was in those jobs as janitors, as in the service industry. They came into the Service Employees International Union, or more commonly known as SEIU. And through their presence, through their being, through their background in this war, and you know, some of the ideas, some of the ideals they walked away with from the war, you know, they walked into U.S. labor unions with these same ideas, and with these same ideals. So they helped to give the Service Employees International Union a more social justice character, a more social justice edge to what they do. And so that's kind of how they started arriving here in the U.S. labor movement. That's some of the effect that, you know, folks from El Salvador have had, especially the folks who arrived here during the 80s, is because, you know, the FMLN painted what a better world could look like for Salvadorans and for workers around the world. You know, they spoke to social justice, and they gave people something worth fighting for. And so when you have people rolling in from another country with these ideas, man, you start to give some life back to these unions. So that's part of what we're talking about. And Jerry's going to expand our knowledge a little bit as far as, what was going on with the unions here in the United States as they related to the struggle in El Salvador during the 80s. So for that, Jerry, I'm going to pass the microphone over to you, brother. Have at it, please, and thank you.
Thank you, Rick. And as we're getting ready for me to scale up my my screen share, I want to ask a question. Like why should workers, why should union members care about what happened in El Salvador and what's going on there today? And that's a question we're going to come back to in just a few minutes. It turns out that a lot of workers cared about what happened in El Salvador in the 1980s, especially the murderous reign of Blowtorch Bob that Rick was talking about. And I'm going to screen share in just a moment some slides that will be a way for me to illustrate some of the points we're making today. So let me just get this thing ready here to do. Okay.
That's looking good already.
There we go. All right. So this podcast today is about worker solidarity, cross-border worker solidarity. And it's about an episode that happened within the highest realms of organized labor in the 1980s, beginning 40 years ago. It's a story that many of us, especially those of us that are, like under 50 or so, maybe have no idea about. But it was a time when the Central America Solidarity movement in the United States, comprising people who cared about the assassination of Bishop Romero in El Salvador, people who cared about the murder of 4 Catholic church women by Blowtorch Bob Jason, just a few months after I think it's Cardinal Romero, I'm not sure, Romero was assassinated. 4 church women were killed in El Salvador. Their bodies were found in a shallow grave below. And this was an episode that made major news in the United States. It was carried by AP, UPI, NBC, ABC, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Boston Globe. And it helped promote the scaling up of the solidarity movement in the United States, the anti-war peace movement in the United States, opposed to U.S. Military aid to the mercenaries in El Salvador and later Nicaragua. The groups that were the most well-known and the best organized were Pledge of Resistance, the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign, which sent some of us down, which sent actually thousands of people to Nicaragua in the 80s to pick cotton and coffee beans for the Sandinistas. Witness for Peace, which was another huge mass organization of solidarity, and CISPAS, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, which is still going strong today. There was a big anti-interventionist, anti-war movement in the United States in the 1980s that dwarfs anything that has happened since the early 2000s in the United States. And the labor movement was swept up in it. Whoops, let me go back. Okay. There's some images of the rallies. We had huge rallies in Washington, and locally we had huge rallies all across the Midwest and Massachusetts and the South, especially in San Francisco and the Bay Area, of 50 people, 100 people, 200,000 people. It was a huge movement. Anybody that was part of it will bear testimony to that. It was also a movement that the then top bureaucratic leadership of the AFL-CIO, led by the late Lane Kirkland, opposed bitterly because by that time, or in that time, top leadership of the AFL-CIO had just switched over from leadership of George Meany, the racist, anti-communist president of the AFL-CIO, in the 50s. And so what we had was a contradiction. We had, on the one hand, we had Lane Kirkland, the president of the AFL-CIO, working closely with Henry Kissinger, the architect of U.S. intervention in not only in Central America, but one man that, as a one-man wrecking crew, destroyed the final negotiations to end the Vietnam War before it finally ended. And we had Ronald Reagan and Joe Coors, the arch conservative moneylender to right-wing causes. All of these folks were like in bed with each other. And it was a strange set of bedfellows, to be sure, especially for Kirkland, who represented supposedly workers in the United States. But in this era, workers in the United States found many of their jobs being exported out of the country into Mexico and Central America as factories and corporate firms and capital sought the lowest wage markets, labor markets, so they could make the most profits. And if a murderous thug and death squads and national armies of mercenaries had to be supported to slap the people around and murder them to make sure that Kissinger and Kirkland and Reagan and Coors got their way, that was a small price to pay. But labor, organized labor, actually, this might be hard to believe today, rose up in opposition to this to the point where a majority of workers in the United States belong to AFL-CIO unions who actively opposed the foreign policy program of Lane Kirkland and the AFL-CIO top bureaucratic leadership. It was led by this fellow here, Jack Shankman, Secretary Treasurer of the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union, who on the one hand was morally horrified by what was going on, but also knew that in the 80s, there was actually still some clothing workers left in the United States, and they saw their jobs going down to low-wage labor markets to work in governments that were keeping honest labor unions in Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Mexico, which kept those unions down so that they couldn't represent and fight for better wages and working conditions for workers in garment factories and agricultural workers in Central America, who now, we're working under, basically working under the gun. So Shankman organized what was called the National Labor Committee against U.S. intervention in El Salvador in 1981. And he succeeded in getting 21 of the top unions of the AFL-CIO, which you see listed here in this wall of names, to oppose Lane Kirkland and his policy. Every time that Kirkland tried to present a resolution at the national conventions of the AFL-CIO to support Reagan's funding, it was opposed from the floor, and it never did pass. And the Amalgamated Clothing Workers led this fight, but as you can see, it was also supported by the UAW, the Machinists Union, AFGE, American Federation of Government Employees, etc.
Workers Union, the chemical workers.
Yeah.
Broad coalition there.
Yeah, very broad coalition. Dave Dyson from the Clothing Textile Workers was the Amalgamated's investigator for working conditions in El Salvador. And I want to quote to you from a statement written by Anthony Batista in Diplomatic History Journal, in which he interviewed Dave Dyson, saying this, that Batista says that the AFL-CIO rather, at times, the National Labor Committee could not defend, but only tried to locate the bodies of, quote, disappeared trade union and peasant leaders. Some of the 10 trips that Dyson made to El Salvador in the 80s had that purpose, as he painfully recalled, quote, in the early days, when I was down there, I used to go out to the dump. I did that twice and tried to look for people that we knew. I was never the same after I did that. I visited the morgue once too, looking for people, unquote. This is what the Amalgamated Clothing Workers did, and their findings were trumpeted to the AFL-CIO unions, and many internationals opposed Kirkland for this reason. And just to give another picture of the evilness of these mercenaries that were supported by Reagan and Joe Coors and from the U.S. State Department and Kissinger. On the left there, you see Adolfo Calero, a leader of the Contras in Nicaragua. And you see in the middle, John Singlov, a out and out, bona fide fascist leader of the mercenary cause in the United States, who was helping Oliver North solicit funds from people like Joe Coors and other wealthy corporate donors to support the Contras in Nicaragua, until it became such a scandal that it almost brought down the Reagan presidency in the Iran-Contra scandal of 1987. In the middle here, you see Reagan talking to Calero with a suit on in the middle of the picture there, with a suit on. So a lot of US citizens, in the thousands actually, went to Nicaragua to pick cotton and coffee beans for the Sandinistas, to show international solidarity with the workers in Nicaragua. And that's what this podcast is about. It's about international solidarity. Now, you know, as workers, we know what it means when another union helps us if we're on strike, donates money to our strike funds, makes rallies for us, sends people to our picket lines, raises food for us, helps us find other jobs while we're on strike. We know what that solidarity means.
That's a big deal.
It means that we can succeed in our strike, that we can be strong.
That's right.
That's what solidarity means here in the US. There's also international solidarity.
That's right.
When we went down to Nicaragua to pick cotton, down the road, there were other people from Holland that were building a school for campesinos living in El Salvador. There were other people from Germany building other facilities for the campesinos living in, did I say El Salvador? I meant Nicaragua. So international solidarity is just a bigger inflation and scope of what local labor solidarity is. It's worker to worker, workers helping workers and forgetting about national boundaries. So that's basically what I have to say. I think that we're going to agree. We're going to agree that we wanted to share these images and some of these words with y'all so that you could get a feeling for what the National Labor Committee did in the 80s. It was a shining moment of what we could all be proud about as trade unionists in the United States. When our unions said, no, you cannot go down there without opposition. You cannot machine gun innocent people without opposition. You can't murder and incarcerate and imprison trade unionists in Central America and expect us to be silent. That's what international solidarity is all about. And so at this point, I think we got a couple of other points we want to make, and I'm going to turn it back to Brother Brian.
All right, Rick and Jerry, thank you for your tremendous contributions. And Rick, condolences and solidarity, but also thank you to you and your people for keeping alive the international struggles in El Salvador and Central America in the 80s and beyond to today. Both of you mentioned international solidarity many times and have said that that's solidarity and that assistance, not just diplomatic assistance or writing resolutions, but concrete assistance in a whole variety of forms to assist the poor and working people of El Salvador and generally Central America. Some of this expression took place in slogans such as "No Borders and the Workers' Struggle," among other slogans that were to build consciousness and also real practical solidarity. Can you just expand, just both of you, maybe Rick and Jerry, each on what kind of practical support took place and why was it so important, especially from places outside of the United States, such as the Eastern Bloc. And I know even though South Africa at that time was under apartheid, there was solidarity coming from there and a variety of other places. Just wanted to see what you all had to say on some of that concrete solidarity, each of you. Thanks.
Yeah, there were all types of there were all forms of solidarity extended to El Salvador during the 80s. There was a wide spectrum, everything ranging from people having protests in Europe and other nations to bring attention and educate their communities as to what's going on in El Salvador. Everything from that all the way to helping supply arms for the People's Movement, for the guerrilla front. So there's been, all types of solidarity that's been extended to El Salvador, and even between El Salvador and Nicaragua. One of the reasons, kind of, we're tying this to the unions now. One of the reasons El Salvador could even put together a struggle was because Nicaragua did it first, and they showed that it could be done. All right, and that's always an important thing. When we're talking now about unions, same thing goes with strikes. If there's a group of workers that goes on strike and they're successful, they will embolden another set of workers to do the same. So that's why this sort of thing is important, and that's the sort of thing that was happening. As I said, these are campesinos, man. They barely, as I also said, these are campesinos who they're agricultural workers. They don't have the money to, buy themselves arms to protect themselves with. That's why the international solidarity was so critical, was because some of the arms, some of the weaponry was coming over from Nicaragua, was coming over from North Korea, was coming over from the Soviet bloc at that point. So that's what kept the struggle alive. How else are you going to do it against $1 million a day military machine funded by the US? So that's kind of how this all ties together. An injury to one is an injury to all, be that two unions in the US looking out for each other, or be it a workers' movement in El Salvador and a workers' movement in the United States or anywhere around the world. So that's the kind of thing that was taking place in El Salvador at the time. Jerry, you want to chime in a little on this one, or?
Sure. I think in Central America, especially in Nicaragua, at least when I was there, the Nicaragua network, which had organized, thousands of North Americanos to go down to Nicaragua, also helped materially, so that when you were in Leon and you saw green John Deere tractors, you knew that they were supported by U.S. resources and the U.S. worker-to-worker solidarity movement. You saw reddish rust-colored tractors, and they were from the Soviet Union, which was also then, before it had collapsed, it was also supporting the workers in Nicaragua. And that's what it's all about. It's all about supporting workers, because that's something that can't be taken away from us unless we give it away. There is no limit to how much solidarity you can show to other workers, either in the state or the city that we live in, or in countries that the U.S. is trying to oppress, across the planet. And the notion that we should just buy American, for instance, is a notion that it tries to contradict the entire notion of worker solidarity. In fact, factories have and corporations supported by the US government has exported virtually every kind of job that is not nailed down in the United States, so that now you can't even buy American. You can't, there's nothing you can buy that's virtually made in America. And this is now extending to call centers and the international flow of technology and the destruction of the working class in the United States. So this is not just a liberal argument that we're making and asking you to try to get behind and understand. This is something for our survival and the survival of our sisters and brothers abroad, Rick.
Yeah, no, that's right. Before we signed in today, we were just going over our notes and kind of preparing to do our little chat. And one of the questions that came up was charity versus solidarity. One of the points I made is for the folks who are listening and watching and know what El Salvador is, oftentimes I've heard it associated with the kind of place where you want to send $1 a day to keep a child alive, extend a little charity like that, right? Versus the type of solidarity that we're talking about, all right? How do you compare and contrast those two? Charity will feed someone for a day and it'll keep a system going. It'll help keep that system maintaining people in that level of dire poverty. And solidarity will give them enough struggle and fight to build a better world. So that's kind of one of the points that we wanted to bring across today is that, solidarity trumps over charity, man. No doubt we want to look out for each other, but we also want to struggle and build a better world. That's why we're promoting the international solidarity. That's why we feel it's important to talk about this stuff, because as Jerry said, it's been generations that our labor leaders have been talking about buy American, buy American, buy American. And what have we been watching? We've been watching the decrease of union membership. We've been watching unions get smashed. The buy American thing doesn't work in the age of globalized capitalism. That's not how you fight back in the age of global capitalism. So that's why we're bringing this conversation up right now. That's why we're giving y'all a concrete example of what it looks like and how it could look like and how we can revive it. So that's the point of today's podcast. Right.
Okay, so I know we're running out of time, so I just have one last question for both of you too. Which you address some points to, but maybe you have other things to add to it. Today, a variety of strikes, unionizing, and other labor actions are happening during this pandemic. And also millions of workers are quitting because of the exploitation and super oppression and super exploitation of their labor power. Why do you think international solidarity is so essential today to building worker and community power in these types of actions, and also moving forward as it seems that there's more and more every day we see more workers unionizing and engaging in other direct action and related struggles?
That's a fair question. And going back to the little conversation that we were having before we all jumped on and started going live, Jerry was sharing how there were more textile workers in the South before, and a lot of their jobs got shipped to Central America. Why? Because that way, the capitalists can take advantage of the relaxed labor laws in Central America, the relaxed environmental laws in Latin America. They can take advantage of free trade, but at the same time, as long as that same textile capitalist can point to El Salvador and say how bad the conditions are, well, that'll open up the conditions to say push for a right to work state in the United States. An injury to one is an injury to all. As long as there's dire conditions in sweatshops for workers in El Salvador, those same conditions can exist in some way here in the United States, either in southern states or non-union workshops or sweatshops in the US itself or right to work states. That stuff affects us. When you look at a map, El Salvador, and I still have to do this one more, El Salvador is closer to Los Angeles than Los Angeles is to New York. That stuff affects us. So that's why we need to get in check with this sort of thing and get on this program, man. The world is in dire condition, and we can't leave it up to a fortunate 500 to fix these problems for us. We need to create a democracy of our own, and we need to build a new world from the shell of the old. That's why we have to start connecting with other workers through international solidarity.
Right on.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Hey, Brian, you want to bring us home? I think we're winding down our time, but I just want to say thank you to anybody who took the time to listen to what we had to say today, and hope to see you next time.
Yeah, thank you to everyone. Brian, you got some closing words? I got some closing words, but Brian, you got any closing words?
I just want to, thank both of you. These are tremendous contributions to today, essential information, and there really are no borders in the workers' struggle. And let's continue to organize, and let's move forward with, the work we've been doing. And thanks a lot for all of your tremendous contributions and the work you put into today's podcast. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jerry. Always a pleasure to have you with us. Today's podcast was inspired by many, many struggles, including the struggle of Radio Venceremos in El Salvador during the 80s. Hats off to them and the people's struggle in El Salvador during the 80s. Next podcast, we're going to bring you some labor theory. We're going to go down a whole list of different ways people and leaders and movements have thought about what the labor movement is. The podcast after that, we're going to talk about some of the ways that labor can fight back. So strikes, general strikes, rolling strikes, sick outs, the whole arsenal of things that labor can do to fight back and make some wins. And the podcast after that is yet to be determined, but it's going to be good, I assure you. So folks, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure. Comrades, always a pleasure. And we'll catch up with you soon. Hasta la victoria siempre, everyone.
Adios, compañero.
There.